A gente não vai dar tempo de fazer realmente todas as perguntas, são muitas. A gente está com o tempo um pouco apertado. Primeiro é o seguinte, no mar, Patri, não há recursos naturais como minerais, água potável, grãos, que todos nós, digamos, take for granted, e que são baratos no continente. Como uma experiência Seasteading vai competir em custo, mesmo levando em conta os custos e as taxas governamentais?
Okay, before I answer questions, I just want to say that I believe in incentives. So if you ask a good question, you get a ducky. And if you ask a great question, you get a shirt. All right. So Hong Kong is an example of a place with very little resources and yet has grown enormous wealth through having freedom. Singapore is the same way. This idea that resources and wealth are the same is just not true. In the modern world, wealth comes more and more from ideas and not stuff. Every city imports its grain from other places and exports services. So seasteads will compete by being like Singapore and Hong Kong, by being free places to do trade. One way that I like to think of it is comparing the ocean tax to the government tax. The ocean tax is the extra cost of living on this harsh environment. The government tax is the extra tax and the cost of regulation on land. The government tax is growing exponentially because it's basically a fixed fraction of our wealth, which is growing exponentially. The ocean tax is going steadily down over time because it's the engineering cost. It's kind of this fixed cost. Over time, as government costs more and more in terms of resources, it becomes makes more and more sense to use technology to avoid government. Those curves have got to cross, and then it becomes worth going to the ocean and dealing with the challenges there to get better government.
Okay. Temos uma pergunta ali da plateia.
Hi, I'm Carlo from the Brazilian Libertarian Party. You took as an example of the necessity of inventing a new technology, the birth control pill. But don't you think the invention of the birth control pill was only possible because previously people believed they need to have less kids? And if this is true, shouldn't we focus on presenting the necessity of less government, to increase the demand for less government, and then let the market create the technology, the market process create the technology?
Well, in a sense, that's what's happening. I'm excited about freedom, and so I'm trying to create the technology to allow more competitive government. All I'm saying is that certainly it's true that the more people who believe in freedom, the more people will be interested in these alternatives, and the more likely something like seasteading is to happen. But I think that in terms of where we are, whether it's more useful right now to put resources into recruiting more people or actually building alternatives, that we are way, way overinvested in recruiting people and spreading ideas, and incredibly underinvested in building examples of alternatives. That is, let's look at the number of people who voted for Ron Paul in the US. Is it enough to make a difference in a democracy? Not even close. Is it enough to build a new country? Yes, by a factor of 100. So we've done lots of spreading freedom. There are plenty of libertarians in order to go create these examples.
Uma pergunta do Fernando Quioca. Após o grande sucesso da engenharia com as ilhas artificiais de Dubai, você já considerou a alternativa de ilhas ao invés de plataformas?
There are some disadvantages to artificial islands. Anything that's within 12 miles of a country is considered part of that country. There's also the issue of if you're fixed in one place, you're much more vulnerable to the nearest country sort of saying that they don't like you and trying to take you over. If you're mobile, you can get countries to bid against each other for the right to host you near them. Right? It's all about competition. If you are stuck in one location off one country, there's not really any competition. If you're in one country, there's no competition. If you can float your little seastead over, next to any one of a dozen different countries, they'll bid against each other for the right to host you.
Uma pergunta aqui do Giovanni Nervo. Você já pensou, Patri, que uma cidade flutuante poderia ficar à mercê das forças de governo já existentes, que os mesmos governos poderiam, mais uma vez, coagir os indivíduos dessas sociedades com o uso da força, pois essas plataformas não teriam como se defender?
A follow-up. The same question, just a follow-up. Lembrando do caso, por exemplo, de Taiwan com China, que foi uma tentativa de procurar a liberdade, ou então o próprio Tibete com a China também. Então, tentar dar um pouco da dimensão do tamanho do inimigo que nós estamos enfrentando. Quando empresas estão concorrendo, chamamos isso de concorrência. Quando governos, mesmo estaduais dentro de um país, estão concorrendo para reduzir impostos, chamam de guerra fiscal. E os paraísos fiscais já são alvos cada vez mais de pressão desses países que não aceitam concorrência. Então, existe platform companies tentando driblar cada vez mais o welfare state, só que encontrando dificuldades porque o poder estabelecido dos Estados-nações é muito grande.
That's good enough for a ducky. So if you look at things like China and Tibet and Taiwan, what you see are people trying to take a country away from a group that already has it. This is why I think the power of going to the frontier is so huge. Because if you try to change things, I mean, if we try to impose libertarianism on Brazil, you've got all of these people who say, this is my country, and I like how things are here. Maybe I don't love them, but I don't like your system. And you know, people will fight really, really hard if they think that you're trying to take over their land, right? That's Avatar. But if you go to the frontier, now it's not owned by someone else. You're going and creating wealth, creating a new society someplace where nobody has this feeling, this attachment to it. And that's incredibly important. When you're talking about these tax havens, if you look at the details, what's happening is countries not letting banks and tax havens hide assets from those countries. You see a little bit of people trying to make tax cartels, but that has been much less successful and because, like any cartel, it's vulnerable to being undercut. So for the United States, where I live, it goes and wages war and puts pressure on other countries, but it does not do this just for kind of any having of freedom. It does this for things which impose on its own sovereignty, its own ability to have its system of government on the U.S. So the U.S. says to the Cayman Islands, you know, your banks cannot have anonymity that lets Americans hide assets from our tax authorities. It does not say you can't have low taxes for your citizens. America says you cannot produce drugs and export them to America. We will send our armies there. America does not say to the Netherlands, you know, you can't let people smoke pot at coffee shops. If you look at what countries will actually go and invade for, it's mostly things that affect the ability of that country to have sovereignty over its own citizens, not people exercising sovereignty locally. So what I want to push for Seasteads in terms of how much freedom they get is sovereignty, authority over local affairs with local consequences. But you know, as I was joking to someone yesterday, on my seastead, drugs will be legal. But when you buy drugs on my seastead, we don't hand you the drugs. We say, lean back and open your mouth, and we drop the drugs in. Because we want to make sure that you're not going to buy a bunch of drugs from us and take them and sell them in some country and piss off that country so that it sends its warships after us. And I think that will work. Some people think countries will come after us anyway. It's one of our greatest challenges, I'd say the greatest besides engineering, and you know, there's no way to give a short answer about our strategies for avoiding that, but you know, I think there's a reasonable chance that we can get a reasonable amount of freedom.
O Roberto Chioca gostaria que você comentasse sobre Sealand, que é um país que é uma antiga plataforma.
Be more specific? Or should I just ramble about Sealand? So Sealand was an abandoned radar platform off the coast of England it was taken over for pirate radio. This pirate radio movement was dramatized in the recent movie Pirate Radio, which you can go see. And the reaction to the pirate radio is actually really interesting from a seasteading point of view, because countries did not go and invade these pirate radio platforms. And just to fill in some context, the situation was that the airwaves in Britain were owned by the government. There were only a few stations, and they didn't play rock and roll. In the 60s, to not play rock and roll, this was really bad. So people set up ships and platforms offshore and broadcast rock and roll into England. England did not invade them because they felt that what they were doing was legal. Instead, the first thing that they did was they banned resupply. They said, stores in England, where we have sovereignty, cannot sell supplies to these pirates. But that's kind of fragile because ships are really good at going places, and until the end, the Netherlands never stopped resupplying. So they just had to go truck over to the Netherlands, go sail over the Netherlands to get their resupply. So that didn't work. So then what governments did was they banned domestic businesses from advertising, because this was the revenue source for pirate radio. They had so many listeners that people really wanted to advertise. Again, this was the UK using its sovereignty locally. It didn't say you can't do this. It didn't send gunships after them. It said our businesses in our territory, you can't advertise. And so that cut off a lot of their revenue, but they didn't have huge costs, and they continued. And what eventually ended the pirate radio was deregulation of the airwaves and playing more, better music. And this is a great lesson for seasteading, because many of you may not want to go to the frontier, to the lower standard of living and the more alternative societies. But this example suggests that those who remain behind can still benefit, because the competition will force the existing countries to do a better job. Now, after pirate radio, Sealand was just kind of this place for a while. And the second business they tried in the late 90s was a data haven, was called Haven Co. And that failed. It failed because a computer can be anywhere, right? So a data haven is competing with every country in the world. And for anything that you would want to put on a computer, gambling, pornography, there's some country that will let you, Costa Rica for gambling, or something like child porn, which no country allows. If you try to do that in Sealand, it's bad enough that countries would invade you. So it was a really bad business model because they were competing with everyone in the world. Pirate radio was competing locally. So I think it's important for seasteads to do things like medical services, where by the fact that we're close to a country means that we're the best alternative, and not things where, like financial services, where you're competing against the whole world because people can put their money anywhere. So there's a lot of good lessons in Sealand.
Infelizmente, nosso tempo para perguntas acabou de estar com o tempo um pouquinho apertado. Eu pediria aplausos aqui para o Patri Friedman.